Dylan Ballback for the plaintiff. May it please the court. Your honors, opposing counsel, members of the jury. Parenting comes with responsibility, and Hayden Durand failed to be responsible. As you've heard throughout today's case, it is a parent's job to teach their children right from wrong. And Hayden Durand did not teach this essential and fundamental concept to Jesse. Jesse still viewed guns as toys and something to play with. This speaks volumes about the blatant disregard and carelessness shown by Hayden Durand when it came to his son's gun obsession. Hayden was told again and again about this extremely dangerous problem and continued to disregard it. In fact, he enabled it by continuing to purchase Jesse the violent video games that intensified his love of guns. Jesse was 11 years old, an age at which children are very impressionable. They're building the moral codes and foundations that will stick with them for the rest of their lives. This is not an age where they should be exposed to this type of violence. Yet, that didn't stop Hayden from not only allowing, but supporting Jesse's love of guns. Hayden did not properly warn Jesse of the dangers of guns, nor did he properly teach Jesse of gun safety. This is not only a case about an 11-year-old child shooting another, but of a parent who failed in his duties. Hayden Durand did not properly teach gun safety, and because of that, Sidney Park is dead. As a plaintiff in today's case, we bear the burden of proof. We have to prove to you, by preponderance of the evidence, our burden. By preponderance of the evidence simply means 50% in a feather's weight, meaning that if you find it more likely than not that Hayden Durand was negligent as a parent to ensure that her child did not pose an unreasonable risk of harm to another, you have to find Hayden Durand, as Jesse Durand's parent, liable. Now, to meet this element, we had to prove 4 things to you today. First was that the parent knew or should have known of the need to prevent the child from creating an unreasonable risk of harm. The second is that the parent did not have reasonable control of the child. The third is that the child acted in a way that was reckless, negligent, or intentional. And the fourth is that the harm suffered by Sidney Park was the direct and proximate result of both the acts and omissions of Hayden and Jesse Durand. Now let me begin with the first, that Hayden knew or should have known of the need to prevent the child from creating a reasonable risk of harm to another. This simply means that Hayden should have known, due to Jesse's threatening and violent behavior, that leaving Jesse in a house with Sidney would create a risk of harm to Sidney. Now, earlier you heard from Campbell Solo. Campbell Solo told you of all the disciplinary notices, all the red flags that were shown with Jesse Durand. You've also heard today that Jesse was very obsessed with guns and with violent video games. Now, due to these 2 factors, there is no way that Hayden Durand couldn't or should have known that leaving Jesse with Sidney that day would cause harm to Sidney. Now, the second element, that parent did not have reasonable control of the child, simply means that because Hayden did not teach Jesse of the dangers of guns, led to Jesse pulling the trigger that day. Now, through those his player notices that Campbell Solo showed you, you also heard that Hayden did not properly punish Jesse for these discretionary actions, nor did he take away Jesse's video games after these discretions. Now, this, combined with a lack of the teaching of gun safety, shows the lack of parenting by Hayden Durand. Now, the third element, that the child acted in a way that was intentional, reckless, or negligent, Jesse Durand proved to you himself. He told you he knew how to load a gun. He looked it up to figure out how to load it. Now, looking up how to intentionally load a gun, that is reckless. Knowing that you're going to play roulette with a loaded gun, that is reckless. Now, as for the fourth element, that the direct and proximate harm suffered by Sidney Park was the result of both the acts or omissions of Hayden and Jesse Durand. Now, we just proved to you that Jesse himself said that he loaded the gun. We proved to you through Jules Sebastian that Jesse pulled the trigger. Now, this act was most certainly the direct and proximate cause of Sidney Park's death. Now, as for Hayden Durand, let me ask you this. Would the child, or parent who properly taught gun safety play a game like this? Would that child load that gun and shoot it at his best friend? Hayden Durand did not properly teach gun safety, and because of that, Sidney Park is dead. Because parenting comes with responsibility, and Hayden Durand failed to be responsible. Thank you.
Your Honor, may it please the court, Your Honors, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, gun ownership comes with responsibility. Home ownership comes with responsibility. And indeed, parenting does come with responsibility. And had the Park family acted more responsibly, had Andy Park and Lee Park behaved more responsibly in their gun ownership, their home ownership, and indeed their parenting, Sidney Park would still be alive today. There are a myriad of reasons that this is the case. There are a myriad of reasons why the Parks are indeed more responsible than the Durand family for what happened on the morning of August 18, 2010. If in fact the Parks, as we have shown, the Parks are more responsible than the Durands for those activities, Hayden Durand cannot be found guilty. Furthermore, we have shown by a preponderance of evidence, which as he said is 50% and a featherweight, that the Parks were negligent themselves in their handling of the gun, and the Parks themselves were negligent in the storage of that gun, and thus contributed to the incident on August 18, 2010. To show this, we're going to bring three witnesses, or we brought in three witnesses. And the first witness we brought in was Ash DeRosa. Dr. DeRosa showed that the letter, that the alleged confession is completely unreliable and should not be taken at face value. Now, our second witness that we brought in was Jesse Durand himself. And Jesse Durand told us exactly what had happened. Jesse Durand told us that, in fact, Hayden Durand had taught him guns are dangerous, that Hayden Durand had told him not to play with guns and to be careful. But more importantly, Jesse Durand told us some other things. Jesse Durand told us how easy it was for two 11-year-olds to gain access to the gun. Jesse Durand showed that if not for the Parks leaving two 11-year-olds home alone with a poorly secured gun, that Sidney Park would be with us today. Jesse Durand also showed us another important thing, that Sidney Park agreed to play roulette. that more than agree to play roulette, Sidney Park came up with the idea. Jesse Duran has shown that Sidney Park, in fact, pointed the gun at his head and pulled the trigger. And if not for pure luck, Jesse Duran could easily have been killed that day. And even more than this, after coming up with the idea of playing roulette, pointing the gun at Jesse first and pulling the trigger, Sidney Park then took the gun and gave it to Jesse Duran and told him to play roulette with her back. That is not only an assumption of risk, that is consenting to the harm. Sidney Park consented to the harm caused to her through that game. Our third and final witness was Dr. Ash DeRosa, a respected gun safety advocate and analyst. And what Dr. DeRosa showed was that the Parks did not follow proper protocol. Dr. DeRosa showed that the homeowner and the gun owner have the responsibility for the safe, secure storage of that gun. That the combination was easily guessable, easily accessible, and thus that the safe, however strong or tough it may have been, was completely worthless. The gun, however reliable it was, incredibly dangerous since two 11-year-olds could so easily access it. And thus, Dr. DeRosa also told us another thing. Not only the responsibility of the gun owner to properly secure it, but that had there been no gun, that had there been no other thing, this case could have been completely different, and everything would have been completely different had the parts simply behaved differently in their storage of the gun. Now, the plaintiffs also called 3 witnesses. And their first witness was Andy Park. And Andy Park agreed that Sidney Park did indeed have an interest in the gun. Parenting does come with responsibilities, as does gun ownership. And yet, despite Sidney Park's interest in the gun, the Parks family did nothing to change how that gun was stored. They did nothing to increase the security of that gun, and they did nothing to make it less likely that Sidney Park could gain access to that gun. And it has been discussed in here how Hayden Grant did not properly discipline Jesse, but there was no discipline for Sidney Park for trying and being interested in that gun, and there was no gun safety training, despite the fact that Sidney Park herself was in the home, lived in the home where the gun was stored, and it was her parents who stored the gun and owned the gun. Andy Park also admitted that she too let her daughter play video games that were violent, that she too allowed the children to stay home. And although Andy Park said that the kids were not left, that Sidney Park was not left alone, and this is true, but Sidney Park and Jesse Duran, 2 11-year-old children, were left home alone on the morning of August 18, 2010, with no adult supervision, and they were left home alone with a gun that was not properly secured. Now, the plaintiff also called Hope Solo, and Hope Solo, no, I'm sorry, Dr. Campbell Solo. And Dr. Campbell Solo testified that, in fact, the Hayden Grant should have known how dangerous Jesse was. But, in fact, while we dispute this, if, in fact, Jesse Duran was so dangerous, then that puts even more of the burden of responsibility on the Parks, because the Parks, as the homeowners and the parents, made the decision to allow Jesse Duran to come over to their house. They made the decision for Jesse Duran to be allowed to play with Sidney Park repeatedly and regularly. And despite even overhearing, even though Andy Park overheard Sidney mention the gun to Jesse, the Parks were willing to let Jesse Duran and Sidney Park be home alone on the morning of August 18, 2010. The final witness that the plaintiff called was Jules Sebastian. And Jules Sebastian told us a number of important details, such that there are fingerprints from Sidney Park on the safe handle, and that there were fingerprints from Sidney Park on the gun. Now, this shows clearly that Sidney Park herself had access to this gun and was involved, and it helps corroborate the story which Jesse Duran told. Overall, what we are showing is that the Park family is indeed at fault, that the Park family had responsibilities which were not met, and for this reason that the Durans should not be held liable. That there's a lot of discussion about gun safety, and yet I'm not aware that it's the responsibility of someone who does not own a gun, who does not take their child out to gun ranges or out to go shooting. I am not aware that it is their responsibility to do the gun safety training. Rather, it would be the Parks family's responsibility to train their daughter in their house with their gun how to behave properly. And this was not done. Further, the fact that the Parks knowingly left the Durans and their daughter alone, that they knowingly left Jesse and Sydney alone, and they did nothing to stop that, that shows that they, in fact, are the responsible party. And so our client cannot be found culpable because he was not, in fact, the irresponsible, because their party was more responsible than ours. Further, they do claim that they satisfy the 4 points of proving negligence, but they do not. Jesse Duran showed that Hayden did his best as a parent. Camp Bel Solo argued that he could have done more, but Jesse Duran, in fact, did show that his father did show him how he should behave and did explain things to him. Many people play violent video games, and that is not a cause for violence. You must find our client not liable because, in fact, the burden of the culpability falls on the Park family. Thank you, Your Honor.
Rebuttal? Yes, Your Honor. May I inquire into how much time is left?
You have 1 minute and 40 seconds.
Thank you. Now, my opposing counsel came before you and talked about Jesse Duran, saying that his father, Hayden, had taught him about the safety of guns, and that Jesse understood these safeties. Yet, why would Jesse look up how to load a gun then? Why would Jesse load that gun? Why would Jesse play roulette knowing the gun is loaded? And why didn't Hayden Duran, knowing that the Parks had a weapon, allow Sydney and Jesse to stay at his house? Now, I'd like to bring you to Logan Bashir. Logan Bashir did nothing to prove the opposing counsel's burden. All she did was discuss a false confession that we did not even mention. And the opposing counsel also spoke of Sydney, saying that by playing this game, she consented to this. Sydney did not consent to this. Sydney did not load the gun. Sydney did not want to play the game like this. Thank you. Find the defendant.